Chapter 5, we're going to be covering the first of the main body systems that we'll be covering in Bio 168, which is the integumentary system. Just as an overview, the integumentary system looks at mainly the skin, but also the accessory structures that are involved in really protecting the body. And so we'll look at, first of all, the skin layer first, and that's divided into two main sections that you see here called the epidermis and the dermis. The epidermis is on the outside, so it's a superficial layer, and it's basically made out of epithelial tissue. And so if you look at the diagram here, you can see they've kind of peeled away a section of the epidermis, but it's basically epithelial cells, epithelial tissue stacked on top of each other. So in this case, you would have a stratification or a stratified layer of epithelial cells. The dermis tissue is connective tissue. So you don't find the same structure here in the dermis. It's connective tissue, and that provides some structural support for your integument or your skin layer. Now, below the dermis, you have a layer called the hypodermis, or sometimes you see this called the subcutaneous tissue, sub meaning below, and cutaneous meaning the skin. So this is actually below the skin. It's not technically part of the skin, so really by definition, the skin is the epidermis and the dermis. And what's below the skin then, the next layer down or deep, would be the hypodermis. The hypodermis is basically still connective tissue, but is considered to be loose connective tissue that helps to connect the layers of the skin to what's below, which would be the muscular layer. And there's also a lot of adipose tissue associated with the subcutaneous layer. So let's look at some of the major functions of the system. As we go through each of the main systems in 168 and then also in 169, we'll be covering functions of each system, usually at the beginning of the chapter. So let's look at some of the main functions of the integumentary system. Number one of the most important functions, I guess, is protection. Protection against many different things. And so part of what your skin does, or your covering, your integument does, is to protect you from any kind of mechanical problems, mechanical trauma. In other words, some kind of injury to the skin or to your body, or an abrasion or a puncture, some type of mechanical problem associated with the body. It helps you to protect from those types of problems. It also helps you protect your body from microorganisms or foreign substances or invading types of organisms. It could be bacteria or viruses or some other type of pathogen, a parasite or something. And so your layer of skin provides what's called the first line of defense against these types of microbes. It also helps you to protect the body from UV radiation to some extent anyway. You have a pigment that we'll talk about called melanin. This is produced in the skin, and it helps to try to absorb some of the UV radiation to try to help protect your body from different types of cancers, skin cancer. Then you have other things like nails that help to protect your fingernails and your toenails, that help to protect the ends of your fingers and your toes, or your ends of your digits, and that's also a protective function. And then also it helps you to help to reduce water loss and maintain fluid balance by trying to retain any water that it has, and you have like an oily surface or secretion on the outer part of the epidermis of the skin that helps to prevent any type of water loss. Number two function is sensation or feelings, and that's along with the nervous system, you have different sensory perceptions that are part of the integumentary system that allows your body to detect pressure and changes in temperature and pain and heat and cold and all these different types of sensations. Some of this actually goes back to protection as well, because part of pain is actually protecting your body from different types of disorders or pains or trauma events. Number three is something called thermoregulation. That just basically means temperature balance. It's the homeostasis of temperature or heat distribution in the body. And so your skin can help in that regard by, number one, sweat. You have sweat glands like we've talked about before, and that allows your body to secrete sweat onto the surface of the body, and that helps to cool off the body. And then also blood flow, that helps to regulate temperature. You can either, if your body is a little too warm, you can dilate some vessels and allow some of the blood flow to go closer to the surface of the skin, and that allows some heat loss through radiation. If your body temperature starts to drop a little bit and it gets a little cooler, then you don't want that heat to escape. And so then the little muscles here actually constrict, contract, and that sends blood deeper in the body rather than towards the surface of the skin. So that helps to minimize some of the heat loss. Number 4 is excretion. And so your integumentary system, your skin, helps to excrete a small amount of waste products, and that's through the sweat. And so your sweat is a mixture of things, including water, also some salt and ions, waste products, urea, ammonia, and even some uric acid. Then number 5, your skin helps in the production of vitamin D. And you have some starting type molecules or precursor molecules, some of the building blocks of vitamin D located in the epidermis. And so whenever those building blocks, I have this listed out for you here, this molecule here called 7-dehydrocholesterol, when this molecule is presented with UV light, UV radiation, it's transformed into a different type of molecule, which eventually gets transformed into something called calcitriol, which is technically the word for vitamin D. And so there's a chemical pathway that it follows to produce vitamin D, but the necessary catalyst for this reaction is UV radiation, which is picked up in the skin. Now, vitamin D is important because it works like a hormone to help balance and increase your calcium levels in the body. Now let's look back at the epidermis, and we'll talk about each of the 2 layers of the skin kind of separately. So let's first look at the epidermis. A couple of things about it. Number 1, it is non-vascular, so it's just completely epithelial cells. You don't have any blood vessels going into the epidermis. And so it has to rely on diffusion in order to go through gas exchange or nutrient exchange to get nutrients and gases into that tissue. The basic epithelial cells are stratified squamous epithelial cells, so you got multiple layers of cells. They're relatively flat cells to make up the epidermis. And they are separated from the dermis by the basement membrane, just like we saw in chapter 4. That's true for epithelial cells sitting on top of a basement membrane. Here you have all of these different layers here would be epidermal layers, and then it would be eventually sitting on top of the basement membrane at the bottom. Now, there are 5 individual layers to the epidermis. Each of those layers usually has multiple layers inside of it. So 5 strata or 5 main layers. And I've got them listed for you here, starting at the bottom. And so the most bottom layer is stratum basale. And so this is the bottommost layer. In the diagram you see here, all of this part of the diagram that you see would be part of the epidermis. And then you have a layer of the basement membrane, and then you have what's deep to the epidermis, which would be the dermis. So if you can imagine, the dermis would be down at the bottom. And so the first layer that you come to, the most deep layer, the basal layer, is the stratum basale, and that's basically your living cells. These are going through mitosis. So these are continually dividing, and they're making new skin cells. This is starting the process called keratinization, which eventually is going to add keratin protein to your cells. And so these cells, it's a single layer thick here, and you basically have fully functional cells that are dividing. They're living cells. They're going through mitosis to make other cells. The next layer that's on top of that, or more superficial layer, is called the stratum spinosum. And so these cells are also living cells. They're about 8 to 10 layers thick, and so you have multiple layers of stratum spinosum type cells. And one of the things that you'll see here is that you start filling up these cells with some keratin type proteins and some lipids inside of these cells. Then the next layer up, more superficial, is called the stratum granulosum. And this is where you're going to find multiple granules of this keratin protein, and the lipids have finally kind of formed inside of these layers. You've got about 2 to 5 layers of cells in the stratum granulosum. Most of these cells are non-living, are not alive. They're non-living at this point. So these cells start to die off, they degenerate, their organelles are breaking down, and the cell is beginning to die in this stage. Now, some areas of the skin have another layer called the stratum lucidum. Lucid here means clear, so this is a kind of a clear zone here. It's a relatively thin layer of dead cells, so everything above, starting with the stratum lucidum and above, are really dead types of epithelial cells in the epidermis. And so you only find the stratum lucidum in special locations on the skin. It's on the palms of your hand and the soles of your feet where you have a little thicker skin. It's thicker because you've got this extra layer called the stratum lucidum, and that's there to really protect the hands and the feet. Then the outermost layer, the most superficial layer of the skin or the epidermis here is what's called the stratum corneum. These, of course, are dead cells. They're referred to as being cornified because inside of them, that keratin makes them very rigid and kind of tough cells on the inside of these cells. Keratinocytes are what are found. It's a special name given to all of these epidermal cells. Most of the cells you find in the epidermis are called keratinocytes. That's because they have that keratin inside of them for the strength and the structural support that the skin needs. And then you'll see this term keratinization. That's the process to make those new cells. Remember, it starts out with the strata basale, those beginning cells at the bottom, the deep layer of cells. They start dividing, they're putting keratin inside of the cells, and in the process, they start pushing up cells so that as they divide, the older cells start to move up and eventually make their way to the stratum corneum. And eventually, these outer cells, these dead cells, will eventually shed off. And so it takes roughly about 40 to 50 days for this process to take place where you're making the new cells, and those new cells finally reach the surface of the skin. Now, there are some other cell types that you'll find in the epidermis, including melanocytes. The melanocytes here produce a pigment called melanin that makes the pigmentation of the skin. And then eventually it gets transferred to the keratinocytes. You'll also find dendritic cells. We'll talk about more about these later on, but these cells are part of your immune system. These are phagocytic cells, so that means they engulf or eat things. So you have a little bit of immune protection inside of your epidermis because of these dendritic cells. You also have a little sensory cells inside of your epidermis called Merkel cells. Most of your sensory cells are actually in the dermis, but you do find Merkel cells in the epidermis, and this allows your epidermis to kind of feel the sensation of touch, especially light touch, and a little bit of pressure associated with touching an object with the outer part of the skin. We mentioned that the term thick and thin skin, so I have a few notes here for you. Thick skin technically has all 5 epithelia strata, so in other words, it does have that stratum lucidum that we mentioned before, and you find it pretty much in areas that you need a little extra protection, and so places that you need protection from extra pressure, friction includes the fingertips, the palms of the hands, and the soles of the feet. Thin skin is pretty much everywhere else in the body. The rest of the epidermis that you find in the body is considered to be thin skin. That just means it doesn't have all 5 layers. It's missing the stratum lucidum. And if you've ever had a callus before, that's a process or a condition where the stratum corneum adds additional layers, usually in response to increased pressure or friction. If you rub a particular area too much and you've got a lot of friction in a zone or a lot of pressure in your fingertips, especially or in your hands, or even in the soles of your feet, that can create a callus just where that stratum corneum has added some extra layers to kind of toughen up that layer of skin. Section 3 is going to talk about the dermis, and so we'll kind of briefly mention a few things here. Remember, this is just directly deep to the epidermis. It is technically part of the skin, and it also has 2 main layers that we'll look at. But notice in the picture, you find a lot of things going on inside of the dermis. So in other words, this is where you're going to find blood vessels. So it's a vascular layer. You find hair follicles located in the dermis. You find some smooth muscle there. So when the smooth muscle contracts, it causes your hair to kind of stand up. You find glands that are inside of the dermis, and you find some lymphatic vessels that are inside of the dermis as well. Now, the two primary layers of the dermis include what's called the papillary layer and the reticular layer. And these are listed for you in the order that you come to. So the uppermost layer is called the papillary area. This is going to be the upper portion of the dermis, and it's basically connective tissue. It's very loose connective tissue. There's an area called the dermal papillae that comes in contact with the basement membrane of the epidermis. So this upper portion here of the dermis is called the dermal papilla region. And you're going to find some collagen and elastic fibers kind of in this area. The majority of the dermis that sits below that region is called the reticular layer. This is dense connective tissue, so it's a little stronger, a little bit more supportive, and it has more collagen-type fibers than elastic fibers. It does still have elastic fibers, but the collagen is there, and it just gives it a little added strength at the bottom layer of the dermis. But it is also the thicker layer.